Yesterday, we focused on the office of the President. As the first aspect of the executive branch of the government. Where the 1982 regime erected a new presidential office which had been intended to function as a tutelary mechanism over the functioning of the public bureaucracy and the smooth operation of the system. As that office would be in charge of monitoring the operations of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the government from the perspective of collective interest of the Turkish realm. Therefore, a president representing the collective realm was installed as an extension of a parliamentary system, which had rendered that parliamentary system somewhat less parliamentary or semi-parliamentary. The election of the president had been left intact, as had been the case earlier in the parliamentary regime raison d'etre, so that an overwhelming majority of the deputies in the Grand National Assembly would be expected to support the election of a president, and therefore the president would be representing a huge majority of the political parties in the Grand National Assembly, who in turn would be representing a large swath of the population, or the voting population, about the age of originally 25, later on 21, and then 18. So that way the president was assumed to be supported by large majorities of the legislature and the people who they represented, and therefore would act above the fray of partisan politics and constantly monitoring collective interests of the realm and stability of the regime. For the 1982 Constitution had emphasized political stability above and beyond all the former constitutions of the country. In the original formulation of the Constitution, the president would not only be elected by the Grand National Assembly, a large majority of it supporting it, but also the president would be elected for a 7-year non-renewable term. All of this changed after 2007, and with 2014 we have a new picture, which I will turn to eventually. The president would have powers of appointment, directly appointing many top-level executive and judicial incumbents of positions which were considered as critical for the operation of the system, and would also be involved in decision-making, especially through the National Security Council. And the National Security Council could then be exploited by certain presidents, such as Özal and Demirel, as an alternative arena for agenda making during their tenure. And that way, the presidents were able to attract the attention of the media constantly and made sure that their names and faces would not be forgotten. And at the same time, they kept their own interest in the political affairs of the country, especially with respect to foreign policy, defense, and security issues, which were considered as the most critical issues of the state, more existential issues of the state, which would be therefore constantly under not only the supervision of the president, but also of his meddling through the agenda being made by the National Security Council. National Security Council operated on the basis of consensus. Therefore, the president in the meeting of the National Security Council was in a position to create some consensus between all the participants. The executive branch of the government, represented by the relevant ministers and the prime minister, and also the top-level bureaucracy and the military at the same time, and there would not be any occasion for voting, that the decisions were made by building consensus, which the president was constantly involved in. So he tried to bring the sides together, make them agree on a certain resolution, and that resolution would be adopted and undersigned by all the members of the National Security Council and would then be considered as a recommendation to the government, which could then work on that recommendation and form foreign policy, defense policy, and security policies of the country. Now, this practice continued until the second decade of the 21st century, from the early 1960s. But previously, in the 1924 Constitution, National Security Council was considered as a part of the Defense Ministry and not necessarily any more than an advisory body on defense-related issues, much more narrow in scope. It had been enhanced in status after the 1961 Constitution, and its importance had been further elevated with the 1982 Constitution, and had been used, therefore, as a forum for the presidents to continue to be important in their management of the foreign policy, security, and defense portfolios of the government under these circumstances. Now, the third set of powers entrusted with the president's office were powers of control. There is a state inspection office, Devlet Denetleme Kurulu, which is directly under the control of the president, which could be ordered by the president to look into any matter of any grave importance. For example, when there was a mining accident in the late spring, early summer of 2014 in Soma, Manisa, in Western Anatolia, it was brought up to our attention again that the Devlet Denetleme Kurulu, State Inspection Office, had earlier investigated the state of the mines and had made various suggestions about improving the safety conditions in the mines, which the mining corporations had not heeded at all. So the effectiveness with which these reports are adopted is also another matter. However, it further created circumstances that there was some laxness in the government's overall attitude towards these corporations, for such a report had been ordered and drawn up by the initiation of Abdullah Gül, not only a president elected by overwhelming support of the Justice and Development Party in the Grand National Assembly, the same party in government, but also a founder of that political party. So even someone who was so close to the government party, when he drew up a certain report, could not get his way under these circumstances. So the effectiveness with which this control is manipulated or could be delivered is, in this instance at least, hardly questionable. So the very effectiveness of the presidential control powers, as it had been intended originally in the 1982 Constitution, is not necessarily a well-thought idea. Such a checking institution would require more powers, especially, probably, of veto, which the President's office has over the legislation, but not necessarily directly on executive action, especially if it is not pertinent to a decision that involved the President's office. Under those circumstances, of course, the presidents can withhold their own approval and signature, and certain decisions could not be made. In those regards, the president has and had a veto power over executive decisions as well, but their scope is much more minor, and in such fine issues as safety of the workers in a mine is concerned, there doesn't seem to be much the president could do under those circumstances. Such matters are not necessarily good at control by the office, but by increasing transparency on this issue and bringing up on the agenda of the day that the political elite discusses, the president, of course, through this office, State Inspection Office, could have a big impact on the very debate of the matter. Then the rest is in the hands of the media, the press, and of course, eventually, the voters, who, under certain circumstances, could be influential in delivering a certain final verdict on the performance of the government. But the President's office is also given with the, is also entrusted with calling a referendum under certain circumstances when a legislature decides on a amendment of the Constitution with more than 60% of the seats supporting in favor, or deputies supporting in favor of that referendum or in that favor of that amendment, but less than 65%, that is practically between 330 deputies voting for it, but less than 367 out of 550 in the legislature, then the president is in a position to decide whether to submit this amendment to the approval of the voters, the people, in a form of a referendum. So this gives the president, again, some power of control over legislative action of the political party in government. Yes?
So if it's lower than 65%, then the president can?
Yes.
not a must.
Between 60% and 65%. It has to be more than 60% of the deputies. However, on all actions of the Grand National Assembly, the President can appeal to the Constitutional Court and ask the Constitutional Court to review the decision of the legislature. So can political parties with parliamentary groups in the Grand National Assembly as well. But this also gives the President considerable amount of leverage over the majority of the Grand National Assembly acting in one direction or another. Under certain specific circumstances, if a government cannot be formed within 45 days after the elections, he can call for early elections and therefore abolish the current Grand National Assembly as well. But there are certain restrictions on that. So there are several powers of control that is entrusted with the President's office. Now this makes an active President and a highly influential President, which is not necessarily very usual in the parliamentary democratic environments. This was especially done after 1982 to ensure that the partisan politicians acting in ways that are partisan political and not necessarily viewing collective interests of the country could create circumstances that make management of the affairs of the government very difficult. And that would then enable the President to take a stand and push them in the right direction. For the authors of the 1980 Constitution came to the conclusion that these small-town politicians who have been constantly involved in horse trading and distributing the emoluments of the state budget once they control the budget were not necessarily concerned with any high moral values or the collective interests of the country. And they could easily breach the laws, and they could easily undermine the interests of the state, the national interest. So they thought that the President would be in a position to look after these matters and intervene effectively when need be, and therefore create circumstances for better management and better government under the circumstances. Now, since 1982, of course, more than 30 years has passed, and the record does not seem to be that impressive as to how things are moving in most occasions. And of course, in 2007, there was a presidential crisis over the election of the President. And this crisis precipitated an amendment of the Constitution with the votes of the majority party, Justice and Development Party. And their votes were not enough. They couldn't get 367 votes. But they were able to get support from the Motherland Party, another political party which had been in government for a long time but was losing popular support precipitously in 2007, had gained some representation through the resignation of some members of the Justice and Development Party deputies from that party group and joining into a smaller block of Motherland parties or party group in 2005, 6, and 7. And this group of deputies moved to support the Justice and Development Party. For the leader of the Motherland Party at the time, Erkan Mumcu, believed that a semi-presidential system would be much more improved for governance and will be better for the democratic performance of Turkey if such a step were taken. The reasons for this kind of argument has never been known, and his thinking has never gone into greater theoretical political science analysis of any nature as to why he made this kind of choice, but supported the Justice and Development Party, which did not help the Motherland Party to win any more votes in the 2007 elections. But the amendment was carried through, and the president was in no position to veto it, for there were more than 65% of the deputies voting for it, which called for a referendum to be carried out by the people for such an amendment. And 70% of the people participated on the 21st of October 2007 in this popular vote, and 70% of them, almost 69 plus some percent of them, voted in favor of popularly electing a president. Again, the public opinion polls indicated no reason why people thought that this would be a good idea. It looked as if people believed that whenever they voted, something miraculous comes out of the ballot box. Not proven argument, obviously. And the miracle has been delivered on the 10th of August 2014, and we're living with it currently. And the basic debates about this vote took place after Abdullah Gül was elected by the Grand National Assembly with the votes of the Justice and Development Party and the Nationalist Action Party, 440 out of 550 voting for him to become the next president of the country. So the president had already been elected by the time of the vote in the Grand National Assembly. And the popular vote on the 21st of October in that popular vote, not only the election of the president directly by popular vote in 2 rounds of elections was accepted, but also general principle of candidacy was also put up for vote, and also the overall principle of quorum in the Grand National Assembly. When could the Grand National Assembly hold a meeting and decide was also put to vote. There was a debate that was going on in the way the article of the election of the president had been interpreted, became a critical political conflict in 2007. But this argument did not start in 2007. Ironically, this argument started in 1989. legislative quorum for presidential elections. When Turgut Özal, the Prime Minister and leader of the Motherland Party, suggested himself to be the presidential candidate in 1989, when the 7-year term of the first president of the 1982 Constitution, the head of the military junta, General Kenan Evren's time was up and tenure was over with. An argument about the principles of how many deputies needed to be present during the first round of voting, according to the then Constitution, came to the limelight of arguments made by a political party which was not represented in the Grand National Assembly in any major way. Therefore, it did get some notice, but not enough notice. Incidentally, this argument was made by none other than he was the leader of the Welfare Party, to which Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Arınç, Mehmet Ali Şahin, and all the other major members of the Justice and Development Party had been members. Erbakan argued, and at the time, Mr. Arınç also vehemently supported the position, that there must be 65% of the deputies present at the time of the first round of elections, for the Constitution had foreseen 4 rounds of elections at the time. So the candidates would run, and there need to be more than 2/3 of the vote for one candidate, for that candidate to be well elected in the first round. If that doesn't happen, there should be a second round. Again, the same principle would apply. 2/3 of the deputies voting for a certain candidate in the second round. If that didn't happen, then in the third round, the leading candidates of the second round, the 2 of them, would take part. And this time, 50% would be enough to get them elected. If none of the candidates get 50% of the deputies, in the last round, only 2 candidates would run, and the one that gets most votes would become the president of the country. This was done to ensure that the Parliament, Grand National Assembly, elected a president. It was almost impossible not to elect a president under these circumstances. However, Mr. Erbakan argued in 1989 that Özal's party should be able to field 65% of the deputies in the first round of elections. They should be sitting there and counted. Because if there were no 65% of the vote in the legislature during the first round, voting is irrational, he argued. There has to be 65% ready to vote. Otherwise, voting doesn't make sense. And voting should not take place. Now, this created a row in 1989, but not big enough row. And in fact, this point was supported by the spokespersons of the Welfare Party at the time. Then, the standing orders of the Grand National Assembly were changed to incorporate this argument to a certain extent and endorse it. So, in 2007, a lawyer, alluding to Necmettin Erbakan's argument, actually, he referred to it. He said, this is not my finding, this is Erbakan's finding. And argued that there has to be 65% present in the first round of elections for the election to start. Without that happening, it cannot start as a process. All those people who had argued in 1989 along the lines that Erbakan suggested, this time ridiculed the man and argued that he was after a coup. That's politicking. That's the beauty of Turkish politics. Today, white is right. Tomorrow, white is wrong, depending on where you stand and where your interest points to that. Yes?
I'm somehow confused with the connection to 2007. You were talking about 2007 and then somehow you jumped back.
Because it was influenced by this argument in 1989. It's the same set of rules. In 1989, these rules were suggested that they should have been interpreted in a way that these 4 rounds of elections should start with 65% of the deputies present in the Grand National Assembly, or otherwise no election of the president would happen.
And that was then incorporated in 2007?
That was then argued by lawyers, some of them, not all lawyers, that the same rule should be implemented in the Grand National Assembly in 2007. However, the party in government argued that that wasn't necessary, because in the second round, if in the first 2 rounds 2/3 of votes were not possible, in the third round, simple majority would be enough. So fielding simple majority should be considered enough for the process to start. Whether the process needed to start with the presence of 65% of the deputies in the Grand National Assembly or not became a hot political football under those circumstances.
But it wasn't implemented.
It was implemented because this argument was taken to the Constitutional Court, and Constitutional Court concurred that there has to be 65% of the deputies present before the voting started. And therefore, they could not start the voting in 2007. So under those circumstances, they decided to call for early elections, ask the people to give them more support so that they will have 65% of the deputies elected, and then start the process. The irony of the matter is that it was the precursor of the Justice and Development Party, Welfare Party, and the leader of the Welfare Party who had made this argument originally to forestall Turgut Özal from being elected, arguing that there were not 65% of the deputies present in the first round of elections in 1989, so he couldn't be elected. This principle was ignored in 1989, and Turgut Özal was eventually elected. But then the standing orders had been changed, and this principle became a major controversy. It was Mr. Kanadoğlu who brought this up as a basic argument at the time, and this matter was brought up to the attention of the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court upheld the 65% or 367 seats argument, and therefore the Justice and Development Party said this is an attempt for coup. So we won't accept it, and we'll go for early elections. And they went for early elections. After the elections, Nationalist Action Party was able to win some votes, And the two of them were able to muster now 440 seats out of 550 in support of the Gül's candidacy and presidency. And he was voted in the first round of elections by the support of two major political parties, 440 out of 550 seats, 80% voting for. But in the meantime, they had suggested that since in the Grand National Assembly, election of the presidents have been becoming a major problem, this issue needed to be solved by the intervention of the people and referred to the people, and popular vote should be the solution for it. The main reason why presidential elections became so important in a parliamentary system was because in 1980, the military had used the inability of the Grand National Assembly to elect a president as one of the reasons or alibis for making a coup. They argued that the legislature is so paralyzed that they could not even elect the president of the country. So, if you read the declarations made by the coup makers, that was one of the main arguments for making the coup. Well, that was not necessarily a good argument. Mainly because in 1980, there was a paralysis of the Grand National Assembly, and the Grand National Assembly did nothing but vote for the president, and the major political parties could not agree on who to elect as a president according to the rules of the 1961 Constitution, because that fitted the interests of the minority political party in government. So I'll go back one step earlier and give you some insight about presidential parliamentary elections and why they played such a big role in Turkish politics before the 1982 Constitution, and why the 1982 Constitution tried to fix this problem, as all constitutions do, fix the problems of the previous era. In 1978, the Republican People's Party came to form a coalition government with 11 members of the Justice Party who had split from that political party. For the Republican People's Party in 1977 elections had more than 41% of the national vote, but they were about 10 seats short of the majority. So they couldn't come to power alone. In this interim period, the opposition, then major opposition, Justice Party, had formed a coalition government with the farther right National Salvation and Nationalist Action parties, which was called a National Front government. And this government had increased the polarization in the system, conflict, and there became a period in which large swaths of the population were sucked into a period of street fighting. In most parts of the country, people started to fight each other as a group was identified as communists, another group identified as idealists, ülkücü, or fascists, and they were fighting among themselves for political supremacy. And this coalition government was not necessarily slowing down the process and effectively controlling the situation. So in 1977, people voted for the Republican People's Party to come to power and establish some kind of stability, but they could not get enough votes to become the party government of the time. So eventually they formed this coalition, which was severely attacked by the Justice Party on moral grounds that these 11 people were cajoled for by means of bribing them with certain benefits, such as ministerial positions. In a certain motel in Ankara, deals were cut, and therefore the solidarity of the ranks of the Justice Party had had been undermined, and they established a immoral coalition between these 11 people and the Republican People's Party. Now, Republican People's Party came to power, stayed in power from the 1st of January 1978 until November 1979, when there were Senate by-elections in 5 provinces. Now, in this period, they failed to do anything better. The political situation got worse. More people started to die from assassinations, assassination attempts, communal fighting taking place all over the country. There was a big amount of sectarian fighting in Kahramanmaraş, Sivas, Çorum, Erzincan, where large groups of Alevis lived. And it looked as if Turkey was going towards some kind of a civil war-like situation by 1978. In December 1978, a major bloodbath occurred in Kahramanmaraş of the Alevis at the time. So 1 year later, in November 1979 elections, Justice and Development Party seemed to have regained a lot of ground, and the Republican People's Party lost a lot of votes. Immediately, the Republican People's Party resigned from government. And a new government was established with the support of these National Salvation and the Nationalist Action parties, not taking part in the government, in the parliament. And a minority Justice Party government was established under the leadership of Süleyman Demirel as the prime minister of the country again. Now, many difficult decisions needed to be made at the time. Economic situation was enormously dire. In that period, Süleyman Demirel declared that Turkey was in need of 70 cents. So it looks as if Turkey had lost all of its foreign currency by that time. And the overall economic policy had to be changed. And he took the decisions on the 24th of January, 1980. Liberate the markets. Lifted all sorts of regulations and controls on the markets, went for complete liberalization. There was a big uproar by the trade unions and the social democrats and socialists in the country. So under these circumstances, Süleyman Demirel calculated that he could not rule the country with a functioning parliament under the circumstances. For the opposition would become so scathing, so powerful, that he would not be able to interact with them in the Grand National Assembly. So he decided, as the leader of this minority government, to lock the legislature in a gridlock of presidential elections, where he would field a candidate against the candidate of the Republican People's Party. Neither could get the 2/3 of the votes necessary, however many times there was a voting to take place. More than, I think, close to 200 different rounds of voting took place, and nobody could get elected. In the meantime, the office of the president was occupied by none other than the Speaker of the Senate, who happened to be İhsan Sabri Çağlayangil, a very close political confidant and friend of Süleyman Demirel. So he had, as functioning president, the Speaker of the Senate from his own political party, and he was in full cooperation with the president's office, receiving no resistance from the president's office. Without the Grand National Assembly effectively working, he could get through this legislation as a governmental decree So liberation took place not by law, but by governmental decree under the circumstances. And Turkish economy started to improve from then on. For the last 34 years, the country has been run as a liberal market economy. And that decision was taken under those dire circumstances when no other decision could have been taken. And he had opted not to have a functioning legislature under the circumstances, which was legitimate. There was nothing wrong with his decision. There was no vacuum. The Speaker of the Senate was functioning as the President. What was the problem? Well, Kenan Evren visited NATO, and in the NATO Chief of Staff's meeting, they joked that Turkey cannot even elect a president. And when he came back to Turkey, he narrated the story. He said, "What a shame. I was ashamed of being harassed by my colleagues in NATO who pulled my leg and joked about not electing a president." And the president didn't have all of these powers at the time. A president was not necessarily such a forceful character. It didn't matter so long as you had an active government, an active prime minister. So under these circumstances, the country could have done without a president. But this was identified as a grave problem of the country. How could the country be without a president for any length of time? Legislature must find a solution to this. So the new constitution had this system of 4 rounds of elections. In the first 2 rounds, 2/3 majority. Otherwise, simple minority would have been enough to elect a president under these circumstances for a non-renewable 7-year term. And that's the reason why there is this hype. So in 2007, the current Grand National Assembly of the time could come up with the same argument and say, look, in the parliament, we have so much difficulty electing the president. We can't get this thing done. They can agree about the president is admitted as a failure of the Turkish political elite. Is this something boastful about it? It's about, we better turn to the people to get the president elected. There will be no problems under these circumstances. And that is how all this issue was suggested, that the people should be brought into the picture to provide this solution to this big problem of the country, where there is no problem. For in Turkey, if Turkey were a parliamentary democracy, it is the government that controls the majority of the seats in the Grand National Assembly and enjoys the support and the confidence. Who would be in charge? Why should there be any president? In fact, in a parliamentary regime, famous French politician Talleyrand argued that he had always wondered about 2 P's in life. Why presidents and prostate gland exist. In a parliamentary system, you need a titular head of state, something like a flag, an image. President is not important. It's the Grand National Assembly, the majority in there, who controls it, and its support for the government that is critical. If there were any problem with that, it has to be fixed. Fixing the presidential elections is a totally useless exercise for any period of time. What would have happened if Turkey didn't have any president? The rule says that the Speaker of the House or the Speaker of the Grand National Assembly will become the president by default. So the position will be filled and there won't be any problems. Effectively, it doesn't lead to anything of that nature. So this issue provided an opportunity that the leader of the Justice and Development Party had been groping for a long time, to make a coup in the system and change it to something authoritarian that looks like democracy by becoming president with all these powers and responsibilities. And these powers are vested in the president, but he is not responsible for the ex officio decisions, and he is not responsible for any other decisions which is countersigned by the prime minister and the minister, whether it's a matter of control or a matter of decision that influences the appointment of someone or any other matter listed here in the Constitution. So there would be an arbitrary rule by an unaccountable president. Greek God. Looks like man, but is God. About the law, about the Constitution, about everything else. Acts as he wishes, without any limits. That has no room in a rule of law or democracy that we know of in the 21st century. Okay? And that is now a big problem. Turkey has a presidential problem today that needs to be fixed. Didn't have one in the past, but now has one and has to be fixed. How? We don't know yet, but we'll see. So, in this October 21st, 2007 popular vote, people were given a choice of either accepting or rejecting presidential candidates to be fielded by 20 deputies of the Grand National Assembly. They would select the candidate. 20 deputies correspond to parliamentary party group. So, one party group per candidate. So each candidate will be fielded by one parliamentary party group. Or if they agree upon among themselves, they could field one single candidate among several party groups. But the selection of the candidates would be determined by the parliamentary party groups. So people doesn't play any role in the selection of the president. So we're leaving the matters to the people, but people have no say in the selection of the candidates. Not even the party delegates have any say in the selection of the candidates. Now, in the presidential and semi-presidential systems, candidates are screened for long periods of time. 1 year, 2 years. In the American case, almost 4 years before they get into this contest. In the Turkish case, a new law was enacted in 2012, Act 6217. And that law restricted the entire campaign period to 60 days. So the Grand National Assembly fields the candidates, and people choose from among them. Therefore, the semi-parliamentary nature of the regime still continues. It is still the semi-parliamentary regime. It's still the parliament that calls the shots, fields the candidates. So under these circumstances, it's the parliamentary party group leaders, in effect, who will decide who will become the candidates. Who were deciding to become the candidates when the parliament elected them? Parliamentary party group leaders. Surprise, surprise. It is the same characters who are selecting these people. And in the case of Özal, and in the case of Erdogan, they selected themselves. One individual selected himself. He said, I am the candidate. Nobody could say no. There was no discussion, no debate, no overall contest within the parliamentary party group, nothing of the sort. If you compare this with, say, the American presidential campaigns, you see that there are at least 5 or 6 candidates fielded per party. Then they debate for long periods of time, ask all sorts of nasty questions about foreign policy, energy policy, abortion, values, religion. You know, they have to answer all these questions for day in, day out, at least for 2 years. Nothing of the sort happened. Instead, the parliamentary party group leaders chose the candidates. In practice, that's what this rule boiled down to. Then fielded them for 2 rounds of elections. If no one got 50% plus 1 vote in the first round, then there will be a second round among the front runner and the runner-up, the first 2 candidates. First 2 that got the most votes among themselves. Then there'll be a second round, and the one who got the most votes in the second round would be automatically elected by popular vote. And there'll be only 2 weeks in between. So 10th of August, 24th of August were the dates set for the first one. Now, this process seemed to have carried through in a very awkward way, in a sense. From 2007 until 2012, for 5 years, no regulations were put into law about the election of the candidates. Then, there was no debate made in the Grand National Assembly about an elected president and the president's responsibilities, political and moral responsibilities, as well as powers. Nobody went through this list again. Nobody went through these decisions. No amendment to this was made. You would still be electing a president, and that president would still be unaccountable. Although he is elected for 5-year renewable term. 5-year and once renewable. So he could run again for another 5 years and serve for 10 years in total. But this person is going to be unaccountable. It is totally irrational. How could someone be unaccountable if that person is going to campaign 5 years down the line again? Isn't he going to give an account of what he had done in the last 5 years to the people to ask for votes? Isn't that accountability? Will that be a violation of the Constitution? Nobody knows. It's a mess under these circumstances. And then the entire process, as defined in the election law, could not be managed properly. For the law said that the campaign process would last 60 days. And it would start 60 days before the end of the tenure of the current president. The then president, Abdullah Gül's tenure would end on the 28th of August. So the campaign should have started 60 days before that. Roughly the end of June. 28th, 29th. Well, since July is 31 days, perhaps 29th of June. Either that date could have been defended. Fine. With the start of the campaign, the candidates would be opening up bank accounts, declaring them to collect donations, which then they would be spending to finance their campaigns. And that will be monitored by the Supreme Election Council, Yüksek Seçim Kurulu. Okay? Fine. When was the Supreme Election Council accepted the candidacy of those who ran for the presidency. The date. July the 11th. Is it before June 28th or after June 28th? 2 weeks into the process. Practically these 45 days became the campaign process instead of 60. By the adoption of the candidates by the Supreme Election Council, Yüksek Seçim Kurulu, on 11th of July. Had any of the candidates made any expenditures before that date? Did they pay anybody anything? According to the opposition, Republican People's Party, the candidate who won, Erdogan, spent 300 million Turkish liras before the 28th of June for his candidacy. Where did this money come from? It is illegal. You let one candidate spend 300 million, let none of the other candidates spend a Turkish kuruş. That is called inequality. And that breaches one basic principle of democratic elections, fairness. This election was not fair, therefore not democratic. I have been arguing this since the 11th of July, in public, and continue to do so, humbly. The entire system failed. The Supreme Election Commission failed. The legislature failed. The people who voted for it failed. It's a sham. 70 years into the electoral process of multiple party elections, Turkey should have done much better in this. Not this. It was an election hijacked under these circumstances, not necessarily a regular democratic election. That's number one problem. Number two, the candidate who won argued that he will not abide by the oath he takes. He argued very clearly that he will not be neutral in his policies, and he will not be a neutral candidate. Although he has taken an oath of neutrality, being non-partisan, and he acts as partisan, which is clear violation of Article 101 of the Constitution, which is a crime. There have been many instances of this. Personally naming the opposition leader, calling him names, insulting him. The president is in no position to do that. Well, he must be neutral. Not be partisan, but look after the collective interests. Should be in a position to get the fighting parties together, be an honest referee, and help them form a compromise among themselves. Could he do this today? The answer is a clear no. Then he argued that he would continue on being involved in public bids and tenders, which is not the job of the president, but that of the prime minister. And it's again a violation of the regulations on tender and public bids. If he does that, or if he is doing that, and we don't know yet. So, now this has created a president with a popular mandate who sees himself as unaccountable, above the law, uncontrolled by anything, can act and move arbitrarily in the system. This is a huge problem. For he is now involved in international affairs of the country, representing Turkey in international fora, making commitments about Turkey, without any responsibility, without any accountability. What if anything awful happens that undermines our national interest or undermines the lives of many people in Turkey because of his decisions? Because he accepts such a position. And that will be another basis for new crises. So we have a situation in which all of this is challenged, no new constitution is drawn, and we're looking at a political system in which the laws, regulations, customs are completely ignored, and we're moving towards something undefined, unknown for the time being. So I have great difficulty explaining to you what it is that we have as Turkish politics, so far as the presidential office happens to be as of today. It's in a state of flux, and we don't exactly know where it is going. And it is a crisis of sorts, which is not yet defined and not managed properly by the system. And that's where we seem to be standing, so far as this presidential system is concerned. Now, of course, from 1920s up until today, the most important and critical part of the executive branch of the government has been the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. And it has two completely different roles, depending on whether it's party government or coalition government. If it's party government, the Prime Minister controls both the majority of the Grand National Assembly and the executive branches of the government and the functionaries who work there. So the Prime Minister becomes the hinge that connects the legislature with the executive branch of the government. It can always count on the support of a majority of deputies in the Grand National Assembly for the actions he and his colleagues in the Council of Ministers will take. And at the same time, he is the boss of all public bureaucrats, and he can order them around. And it's a very powerful position, not unique to Turkey. This exists in every parliamentary system. Yes, sir.
The Prime Minister has to be
a deputy.
Parliament?
Yeah.
Correct.
He has to be a deputy of the Grand National Assembly, yes. Though the ministers need not be. You can appoint ministers who have the same credentials as that of a deputy to serve as a minister, any minister, but not the Prime Minister. Prime Minister must be a member of the Grand National Assembly, therefore elected by the people, and must be in control of this mechanism. That was why Tayyip Erdogan, although the leader of the Justice and Development Party, could not become the Prime Minister until he was elected on the 9th of March 2003. In that period, Abdullah Gül, the former president of Turkey, had been the Prime Minister of the country between the 3rd of, well, they got their actual official documents in December, but the elections were in November, early November. From November until the second week of March, Abdullah Gül functioned as the Prime Minister. And Tayyip Erdogan had been banned from politics because of a Constitutional Court decision earlier, and therefore he could not serve as the Prime Minister until he was officially elected in a by-election on the 9th of March 2003, and then he became the Prime Minister of the country. But in coalition governments, of course, the Prime Minister cannot simply assume alone the support of the Grand National Assembly's majority any longer. It is a group of party leaders, at least two in a coalition, or more, 3, 4, whose party groups will be supporting them in the government. And it's the leader of this small pack who becomes the prime minister, and as a result of which, prime minister is in a position of coordinating and cooperating between the coalition party leaders and also the council ministers, and also make sure to hold the majority of the Grand National Assembly together. At the same time, oversee the functions of the bureaucracy, again, but not with the same kind of power that a leader of a party government has. Therefore, such a prime ministership requires different skills, talents than that of a leader of a party government, who could become more despotic, authoritarian, or authoritative in his demeanor. Whereas in coalition government, we have a different character, more of a coordinator. Someone who is more like a conductor of an orchestra rather than the general leading an army to a battle. It's two different kinds of roles that prime ministers have. In legal terms, a prime minister is defined to be the first among equals. In Latin, primus inter pares, first among equals. Well, legally speaking, therefore, prime minister is not any different than any other ministers in the Council of Ministers. However, in practice, in party government, he is a dominant decision maker. Most prime ministers acted as if they were the boss of those ministers. There was a relationship between a dominant figure, a boss, and those who serve under this person. Therefore, we observe a dominant decision maker whose decisions seem to be first among equals, and unless he decides or approves of it, or she decides and approves of it, no decision can come out of the Council of Ministers. Of course, he has immense powers of persuasion because he leads the political party and has a lot of say in who gets re-elected. And that gives the prime minister huge power over all the other ministers who depend upon his support to get re-elected. Even at times in the 1960s and 70s, we had primary elections. Party leaders' stature, party leaders' overall attitude mattered in the selection of a certain candidate and the placement of that candidate on a list ballot. Unless you have a relatively electable position on a list, you don't get elected. And that position can be determined or intervened by the party leader effectively. So under those circumstances, dominant decision maker in party government seems to be the kind of position that you would find a prime minister playing in party government, and more of a manager in coalition governments. However, since the position of the president seems to have been in flux since August 2014, we don't know which of these two the current prime minister fits into under these circumstances. Does the current prime minister of Turkey control the Justice and Development Party alone? Can he call the shots for re-election chances of the deputies serving in the Grand National Assembly? Or will the president continue to do so, in spite of the fact that that is illegal? We don't know the answer to this. I'm not so sure whether the prime minister knows either. There's no indication that the relationship of the party to the president, who is not a member of the party, for the Constitution clearly states that as soon as the president is elected, he loses his seat in the Grand National Assembly and party membership. All ties with the party get severed. And that also created a big row at the same time after the 10th of August elections. And there seemed to be irregularities in there as well, for which the party leadership could also be held accountable, as well as the president himself, if in the future there is any kind of legal investigation into these matters in Turkish politics. So this position may also be evolving into something else, especially if the constitution changes. But the prime minister is in a position to redefine where the prime minister stands vis-à-vis the president, executive and the legislative branches of the government, because he could control effectively the bureaucracy and the legislature if he wanted to, and if he could. And he is in that strategic position. Whether he can use his own abilities to control this situation is something we don't really know. We will discover that in due time. Now, each ministry is run by an undersecretary, a müsteşar. And after 2011, a new rung was inserted into the hierarchy, known as assistant minister. And again, this was invented in 2011 and has been in practice for the last 2.5 years or so. But if you look into the literature, you don't, especially into the literature of administrative law, you don't find any agreement among the students of administrative law as to what this is. Is this a political appointment? Is this a politician? Is he a party commissar looking into the operation of a one-party system, such as the communist parties had such commissars looking into the departments? Is that the equivalent of that? We don't know. Most argue that these people are bureaucrats, not politicians, even when they're appointed politically, even when they had never served in those bureaucracies before. They may be considered either as consultants or extra-hierarchical officials, memur in Turkish. And there is some writing by the students of administrative law who argue that these people should be treated as memur, has the rights and duties and obligations of a memur, and nothing more than that. And of course, that has created an interesting situation, for we don't know, how this is going to be managed in the future. If the government changes hands, will these positions be kept? What are they serving? What do they serve? Still, it's not very clear. We will discover in due time. Has this made any impact on the performance of these ministries? Their political performance, bureaucratic or professional performance, legal performance. The jury is out on that. We don't know yet. And so much time has passed and nothing seems to have been answered very carefully. They may be eavesdroppers. They may be controllers. But there may not be anything more to it than that under any circumstance as such. Now, the former center within this Council of Ministers was constituted around more or less 4 or 5 ministries. Definitely, Ministry of Finance played a major role. They control the purse of the state, and therefore, without the support of this ministry, no action can be taken on any matter. Then, Defense, Home Affairs, İçişleri Bakanlığı, in other words, Foreign Affairs, and several state ministries in charge of security were considered to be the core of this center. When we talk about the state, the basic matter has to do with final decision making about death and life issues. And in that case, of course, these are the most important ministries that determined such critical issues with any kind of power at the time. But the old center lives no more. It became very effectively penetrated by the good old periphery, and over long years of partisan appointment, where merit has become less and less important, partisan loyalty has become more and more important, especially currently. These ministries have become less professional, more partisan in their operation. And as a result of that, the difference between the old center with its own culture, different kind of upbringing, members coming from certain ministries are being sort of manned by people who graduated from certain institutions, such as the Galatasaray Lisesi and Mektebi Mülkiye, or Siyasal Bilgiler Fakültesi, which used to be the most important and crucial institutions to get a job in foreign ministry or defense. Not so much defense, but the other departments, home affairs or finance, etc. Defense was much more embedded in the same bureaucracy as the military. And the civilian bureaucracy usually had their best and the brightest members coming from several institutions. And these happened to be specifically established for this purpose. Mektebi Mülkiye was established originally for this purpose, to educate bureaucrats after the beneficent reforms of 1839 in Istanbul, close to the palace. And then moved to Ankara and has served for this purpose. Its numbers have dwindled over time, especially with new universities being established and new universities providing stiff competition. But more recently, political appointments have taken place where a lot have been appointed to these positions for political reasons, not because they know something, that they're professionally educated for this purpose. The last on this was foreign ministry. A couple of years ago, foreign minister declared that the Turkish embassies were not enough around the globe. Turkish diplomatic corps had about 1,200 members for the last 90 years or so, and that this number was not enough. As a great power, great nation, etc., we need to have 5,000. So new members were recruited, mostly by political concerns, and therefore the entire institutional character of the foreign ministry is rapidly changing because of this, under these circumstances. And that's what I mean by old center simply evaporating. This center-periphery divide does not exist as a cultural divide any longer, in the way Sherif Mardin once upon a time defined it to be for the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. No longer exists. It has gone. Cultural heterogeneity exists in Turkey, and there are cultural differences, important differences. There are different camps of people, and among them there is a big fight going on, which I called Kulturkampf, following the suggestion of Nuri Alman of Harvard University. But that's a different phenomenon. It does not have any correspondence with the power relations of a center removed and homogeneous from the rest of the society versus a periphery which is heterogeneous in its composition and is poised against it. Military continued to function as a special pressure group and from time to time became a political party, especially when they had their say in the coups of the country. And there were many of them. But of course, these coups were of different nature and you have to keep them in mind as such. The 1960 coup was a young officers' coup. This was carried out by officers whose average rank was that of perhaps a major or a captain, not more than that. They did not have as a leader from the ranks of the generals until very late in the game. Then they were able to co-opt Cemal Madanoğlu as a two-star general. And finally, in May 1960, when Cemal Gürsel, as the commander of the Third Army on the Russian front in the east, resigned from his position, they also were able to co-opt him at the very last minute, but as a figurehead, not as an effective commander. These people who played a major role in the organization of the junta that carried the coup, it was Alparslan Türkeş, Talat Aydemir, Haydar Tunçkanat, and others who were low-ranking officers when the organization had started in 1954. And they had gained the rank of colonel in most occasions by the time they carried out the coup in 1960, 27th of May 1960. This coup was not only against the Democrat Party government. Yes, they did remove the Democrat Party government. They arrested them. They arrested their deputies in the Grand National Assembly. They abolished the Grand National Assembly, and they tried these people for treason. However, they also removed effectively all top-ranked generals as well. Among them, the Chief of Staff, four-star General Rüştü Erdelhun, was also arrested by them. He was also tried in the special tribunal at Yassada, one of the Principos Islands, or Princess Islands, where there was a naval base, no longer exists, and they were tried there. And also Rüştü Erdelhun, the four-star General Chief of Staff, was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. There were 24 sentences of death in those trials. 3 of them were carried through. The Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. Adnan Menderes, Hasan Polatkan, and Fatih Rüştü Zorlu were executed. The rest were eventually pardoned. Now, they also arrested the president of the country, Celal Bayar. So it was an anti-establishment coup, not only against the party in government, but also against the top-level generals as well, top-level bureaucracy as well. All the undersecretaries of ministries were also arrested. Now, in 1962, there was another attempt at sort of taking back the reins of power and helm of government under the control of one colonel, Talat Aydemir, who had come back from Korea, where he had been serving, and was not part of the action on the 27th of May 1960, assumed that things didn't go in the way that they had originally intended. So he made another attempt at making a coup, 1962, this time against the coalition government headed by İsmet İnönü, the Republican People's Party. He was caught and pardoned. 1 year later, he repeated the same thing. This time he was caught, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted, and he was also hanged, with Fethi Gürcan, another accomplice, former major. So the young officers' coup continued into 1963, many attempts. And they continued not only against the Democrat Party, but also the Republican People's Party and the coalition government that came after 1961, in which the major partner was the Republican People's Party, and the Prime Minister was İsmet İnönü. So the obfuscation and simplification that it was CHP who had organized this coup against the Democrats because they couldn't win elections in 1950s, etc., does not have much evidence as far as we can tell. Yes, there have been some attempts at contacting the CHP. They had brought in the CHP in the consultative assembly or constitutive assembly, Kurucu Meclis, in the making of the Constitution. But that's not enough to argue that there was a complicity of that political party in action. We don't have that. But the conditions in 1960, when the military moved in, was such that the country was not being run properly. And right before the coup, all major cities were put under martial law and curfew. For stability had broken down. And the civilian government had, by doing so, announced that they can't run the affairs of the country properly. And they need the military to hold on to the stability of the system. They were no longer in charge. The military were. And declaring martial law is the first step of a slippery slope to the coup, eventually. So the most important task of the civilian governments is not to degenerate the relations among them to a point of declaring martial law and turning over the security of the streets to the military under any circumstance. And this was done every time Turkey had a coup. Again, in the March of 1971, there was a first major move by the top-level generals this time, the Chief of Staff and the commanders of the major armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Gendarmerie. They moved against some young officers and arrested them on the 9th of March, 1971. 3 days later, they issued a memorandum, and it's this memorandum which precipitated a series of events in which the Prime Minister resigned, Süleyman Demirel again, and also the General Secretary of the Republican People's Party, Bülent Ecevit, resigned, arguing that this memorandum was declared against him, although there was again no evidence indicating to that in that direction. With the purge of 9th of March 1971, the process of young officer coups that had started in 1960 stopped. From then on, we did not see any other indication of young officers' coup or attempt of it until today. And there is none so far as I can tell. So 12th of March 1971 was coup of memorandum, but it was not a full coup in the sense that the Grand National Assembly was not abolished or suspended from action. It continued to act. But the government was toppled. A technocratic government was installed in the place of the elected government, and the Grand National Assembly extended its support for it. Now, in 1973, the generals tried to install their own candidate as the president of the country. However, the Grand National Assembly did not vote this person to become the president of the country. Instead, they selected another person, again a former admiral this time, Fahri Korutürk. And the choice of the military, especially the land forces, Faruk Gürler, was not elected by the Grand National Assembly. So having the Grand National Assembly seemed to have continued to matter under these circumstances. And this coup ran its course for about a year and a half. And in fall of 1973, there were new elections again. In the meantime, the Constitution was amended in a direction that the Justice Party had been arguing in the past. It was through these amendments, for example, for the first time, state security courts were established to look into the matters of terrorism for the first time, which was suggested by the Justice Party spokespersons earlier. There were some refining and trimming of freedoms under these circumstances in the 1973 amendments. However, the electoral system continued to produce fragmented Grand National Assembly, as a result of which Turkey was to be ruled by coalition governments from 1973 until 1980. And in the meantime, Turkish economy was deeply battered by an oil crisis in 1973, which started after the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, and the arms embargo imposed upon Turkey by the United States in 1975 after the intervention of Turkey in Cyprus in 1974. The Turkish governments were unable to change the economic model of import substitution that had been in place since the 1950s. And these did not necessarily produce any major changes in the performance of the economy. The trade imbalance, huge trade deficits continued. Value of the Turkish lira started to slip again rapidly. And under the circumstances, the economic situation began to look more dire by the day. There were also an increasing trade union activism for the first time. Trade unions had been established strongly after the 1963 amendments of the labor law, which was credited to Bülent Ecevit, and he was then designated as the champion of the Turkish labor and supported by the toiling masses in the 1973 and 1977 elections, by which time Bülent Ecevit had been able to topple İnönü from the leadership of that party, and he passed away soon after in 1973. And Bülent Ecevit became the leader of the Republican People's Party from 1973 until 1980, when the party, or 82, when the party collapsed, was closed down by the military in 1982. So in that period, there was not only economic downturn, but political mayhem, which increased after 1975, and it turned into something like a civil war. By the summer of 1980, approximately 5,500 people had been killed by various assassinations carried out throughout the country. Bombings also had become more or less routine. And by summer 1980, there was no part of the country where you could sleep without hearing the rattle of machine guns effectively. So when the military intervened in 1980, many believed that they were able to save their lives because of this intervention and enjoyed some support, whether you believe it or not. That was a corporate coup. It was carried by the military institution. It was instituted, no longer young officers. They came to power, established a constitution, and tried to draw lessons from what happened between 1961 and 1980, and change the constitution accordingly. And went back for multi-party politics in 1983, heavily controlled through unfair and not free elections. In spite of that management, Motherland Party was able to win the elections and stay in power until 1991 alone, winning another election in 1987. However, this new constitution had created a new situation in which, number one, the trade unions were crushed. Political parties were, all of them were closed down. New political parties had to be established in their places. Their party leaders were banned from politics for up to 10 years. Lower ranked party leadership for 5 years. And therefore, there was a sort of a turnover of the elite for a brief period of time. And at the same time, anybody who was leaning left was considered to be a suspect and were prosecuted, even persecuted. Several 100,000 were tortured. Many died. Some were executed. About 280 were found guilty of Venice acts, and they were executed by hanging. And many unjust treatments had taken place under these circumstances, and there were big purges of people from positions because they were involved in activities against the state, argued the military. There was a special act of 1402, 1402, which resulted in purges from the public bureaucracy to a great extent. In their place, they were able to get new appointments, mainly from more conservative and more nationalist members of the society. So the overall characteristic of this coup was anti-left. And it had been in cooperation with a movement of intellectuals known as the Hearth of Intellectuals, a right-wing think tank, Aydınlar Ocağı in Turkish, who formulated an ideology called Turkish Islamic synthesis, so that Turkish nationalism and religiosity of, especially with a Sunni flavor, would be mixed to become the dominant ideological orientation of the 1982 regime. This became more or less the official ideology of the system. Lip service was paid to Kemalism, which didn't make much sense under the circumstance. And at the time, especially the coup leader, Kenan Evren, was effectively involved in providing the correct interpretations of the Quran in various public gatherings he had been holding alone under these circumstances. And many critical members of this group of people were employed in the Turkish radio and television, which was the only radio and television in operation in Turkey under the circumstance. So heavy indoctrination of the people were carried through in this process all the way until the end of the coup period, more or less either 1984 or 1989, depending on which year you would take. And it resulted in the purge of anything left-wing. Then, of course, on top of that came another big shock to the left, collapse of the Soviet Union. And a huge swath of the population now started to assume that socialism was a farce. It didn't require to be considered seriously, and therefore it lost all of its allure. Trade unions were gone, left-wing political parties were gone, leadership was prosecuted and persecuted, banned from politics, as a result of which a new elite group was promoted to become critical in re-educating the public along their own thinking of heavy doses of conservatism and religiosity married with nationalist ideas and ideals, which precipitated a major reaction in 1984 by the re-involvement of the Kurdish nationalist movement of the Partiya Karkeren Kürdistan, PKK, in targeted attacks against Turkish military and police installations in the east. Now, that created a new conundrum for Turkey. as to how to deal with this phenomenon, provide a military solution to it, which was definitely tried, as some military and police action was obviously necessary. But at the same time, it was suggested that the dosage of religion should be increased to reconstitute solidarity of the land, not on the basis of a modern, secular, science-based ideology, but one that is based on Sunni religion, which would forge a more robust union of the country more effectively. And that didn't seem to bode well with the thinking of the military. Therefore, this triangle that had been established in 1982 between the military, Turkish nationalists, especially ethnic nationalists, and political Islamists, came under stress by the aftermath of the first Gulf War, when northern part of Iraq became a protected land from which PKK now could launch a much more severe and serious attacks on Turkey. Number one. Number two, Turkey decided to impose an embargo on Iraq very early on. I have heard many people who had been very close to Özal argue that in a private talk, he first argued that this is a time when Turkey will invest 1 and get back 20 in return. So Turkey should be on the forefront of these forces fighting with Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait and imposed an embargo and sealed the border effectively. Now, that idea was carried through. Very, very interestingly, in most occasions, Turkish bureaucracy has never been so effective, but in this case, they've been relatively effective, assuming that something of a big reward will be coming towards Turkey from the US or NATO or some other such force eventually. Actually, the immediate result of that was a complete downturn of the economic circumstances of the east and southeast of Turkey. For between 1980 and 88, Iran and Iraq were at war. Turkey had built in that process the biggest fleet of trucks in Europe, hauling whatever the two needed for the war through Turkey from Europe. Germany, Netherlands, Italy, what have you. You know, they were shipping the needs of Iran and Iraq for the war, and it was the Turkish trucks and the truck drivers doing that, most of them from the east. And the east had adjusted to this situation by the emergence of many hotels, restaurants, places catering to the truckers, also automotive parts, automotive repair shops, also gas stations, mushrooming all around the world, unemployment decreasing sharply, and the economy of the East and Southeast taking off. However, at the end of 1990, 1991, when the embargo was slammed, there was a huge break on that economy. The economy of the Southeast collapsed as they stopped trading with Iraq. Iraq was the second largest trading partner of Turkey at the end of the 1980s to Germany. It became a marginal trading partner in a year or two. And in the meantime, this booming economy of the eastern part of Turkey experienced a big downturn. It looked something like this. This looks like an inverted J. Davies is an article which argues that when economic growth suddenly stops and has a U-turn, which he calls a J curve of growth, it is a recipe for revolution. Davies argued that this is what happened before the French Revolution, and this is what seemed to have happened before the Iranian Revolution. And something very similar seemed to have happened in eastern Turkey with the embargo imposed upon Iraq in 1990. It began to influence a large geography, and a huge number of people turned against Turkey, Turkish government, Turkish economy, Turkish policies, and gave enormous support to PKK. And in this process, Turkey was groping in this triangle to find an answer to this mayhem, what needed to be done. And it looks as if in this process, it became possible, as the leftist ideas were decimated, and that terrain was now left into the hands of the PKK, which had emerged as a Maoist organization and had been suggesting a secular and socialist one-party system along Maoist lines of the Chinese type of revolution from the rural areas. Left started to lose its allure, and it looked as if the Sunni Muslims among the Kurds started to give support to the religious political Islamist organizations and political parties. And the basic argument that they have been making, that Turkey should become more religious and establish a solidarity based on religion, came to a head with the military by 1997, when the political party of the National Outlook movement, which came out of political Islam, Welfare Party, had become the front runner by 21% of the national vote in the 1995 elections, established a coalition with the True Path Party, and started a clash with the military over a series of major issues, at which time the famous 28th of February 1997 meeting of the National Security Council occurred, in which these religious activities were questioned by the military, and the party was indicated to be out of line with this agreement that had been established in 1982, that they should be in the back burner, in the back seat, and the military should be in the driver's seat from now on. And they seemed to be challenging the idea, and therefore the military had to remind them of this and pressured them dearly under these circumstances.